and I would like to welcome you all to my keynote of today, an introduction to Blazor and Umbraco 9. So before we get started with the informative part of today's presentation, let me start off by introducing myself. My name is Corné Hoskam. I'm a software engineer over in the Netherlands, currently employed for a company called WeAreYou, becoming IO. Looking back at my first interaction with Umbraco, that's been around 5 years ago, but during that period, in the last 2.5 years, I've been working full-time with Umbraco projects ranging from Umbraco 6, 7, 8, and now, luckily, Umbraco 9. Besides that, I'm also an Umbraco certified master, and since January 1st this year, I have started my own tech blog, which up until now mostly consists about Umbraco-related content. But enough about me, let's get started into the technical parts of today. So, there are a couple of different subjects that I want to be talking about today, that will hopefully answer your questions about Blazor if you have any already. First off, we'll be taking a look at Blazor itself by answering the question, what is this Blazor people keep talking about? Next up, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of today's talk by explaining what's possible and needed to integrate different versions of Blazor into your existing or new Umbraco 9 application. And finally, we'll be taking a look at the pros and cons of using Blazor with Umbraco 9 so that we can determine whether or not you should be using Blazor in your website. So let's get started. So what exactly is Blazor? Blazor is an open source framework developed by Microsoft, which is used for creating interactive client-side web UIs using .NET. In other words, Blazor is a .NET framework that allows us to render a UI using HTML and CSS for a wide range of browsers. Where in a more commonly known scenario, you would use JavaScript for any and all browser interaction, with Blazor you can use C# instead of JavaScript. Not just that, but because it's all based on C# and in particular .NET, it allows us to share the same server-side and client-side logic in our apps written in the same language and frameworks. So now that we have a very basic idea of what Blazor is, how can we run Blazor C# or .NET in our browser? And the answer to that would be WebAssembly. So now you may ask, what exactly is WebAssembly? Without wanting to go too technical, let's get a brief overview of it. Blazor itself runs on WebAssembly, which is a low-level assembly-like language, and by now a web standard that runs on all the major browsers and operating systems, including but not limited to Firefox, Chrome, Edge, and Safari. With WebAssembly, it allows us to run our code to near native speeds compared to non-browser applications, and it runs alongside and complements JavaScript perfectly, where you can combine WebAssembly's performance and power with JavaScript's flexibility. So now that we have a very basic understanding of what WebAssembly is, it's good to put them in practice. So the things we just mentioned about Blazor and WebAssembly, so far they only specifically cover half of what Blazor is, and in particular Blazor WebAssembly. In fact, there are two different hosting models of Blazor, which would be Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor server-side that we can choose from. Let's take a look at the different versions of Blazor and at the difference between them, starting with Blazor server-side. Server-side Blazor is the version of Blazor that, as the name would suggest, both runs and stays completely on the server. In this case, the server is responsible for any and all interactions that happen in our application, and whenever an update or interaction takes place, the server calculates the difference in our DOM or the difference in our HTML and sends that over to our client using a SignalR WebSocket connection. Our browser then updates our UI, which means that no .NET code ever leaves our server. This particular version of Blazor also does not in fact use WebAssembly to run, but only a very minimalistic use of JavaScript. When we load our server-side application in our browser, what we can see is that there are a relatively small amount of files that are being transferred to our browser. In total, less than a couple hundred kilobytes are transferred on the initial load. The most important one to note would be the Blazor server.js. This file in particular allows our application to establish the SignalR connection over the network to handle all the UI updates and event forwarding that happens. When installing and launching a Blazor server-side application for the first time, we are greeted by this lovely Hello World application, showcasing some very basic functionalities of Blazor, with things like a counter or showcasing the ability to fetch data. At this point, it is good to mention that there is one major downside to using Blazor server-side, and that is the fact that all updates do in fact take place on the server. Not as much as an issue, but for our application to run, we need to be able to maintain a stable server connection. If not, the following happens. We get greeted by a very unfriendly attempting to reconnect to the server message, and our application will freeze. The second version of Blazor would be, and the most notable one of the two, Blazor WebAssembly. With Blazor WebAssembly, our entire application is executed directly in our browser using WebAssembly instead of requiring an active server connection. Any and all interactions that take place on the browser stay within the browser and get processed and updated locally using what we just learned about WebAssembly. When we load our WebAssembly application in our browser, we see that there are quite a large amount of files that are being transferred, especially compared to the server-side variants that we just showcased. Instead of the Blazor server.js, our WebAssembly application relies on the Blazor WebAssembly.js instead, which in turn downloads the .NET runtime and all the compiled DLLs of our application, which are needed to actually run our code. So when installing and launching a Blazor WebAssembly application for the first time, we notice that we are greeted by a very similar looking Hello World application. And you would indeed be correct. Both versions of Blazor are component-based, and other than that, there are a couple of nuances that makes each version of Blazor, so Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor server-side, a little different. We are able to use the same components for both versions of Blazor. The major difference would be between the two, whether or not we are executing the code locally in our browser or all on the server. So now that we have a very basic understanding of what people are talking about when we mention the word Blazor, let's bring the world of Umbraco into the picture, shall we? Because there are two different hosting models of Blazor, we will also be looking at how we can integrate them with Umbraco separately. We'll start off by taking a look, like before, at Blazor server-side. The benefit of Blazor server-side is that we can add it to an existing Umbraco 9 application relatively easily. Not just that, but instead of our entire front end relying on Blazor, we can choose to only use Blazor in one particular part of our application, and maybe even only one particular part of Blazor if we wish to do so, instead of having to require Blazor everywhere. So there are a 4 steps that we have to take so that we can configure our application. First of all would be that we have to configure the Blazor server-side services itself into our application, having to do with both the services that get injected into our website, but also the endpoints that are required for our Signal-R connection to take place. Next up would be the addition of the Razor directives into our application, which would, in technical terms, be an imports Razor file at the root directory of our application, so that all our Razor views or components have access to their required namespaces within our application. Third step would be that we need to add the Blazor server.js somewhere in our HTML or front end, which can be either our specific component or within the template of our entire website. And lastly, we have to make sure that we actually render our component somewhere on our application. So let's take a look at a quick example for those who haven't used Blazor before. When we install a fresh install of Blazor, what we can see is that with one of the basic example components that ships with it will be a counter. What you can see in this example code would be the fact that we have a paragraph and a button currently displayed, with a button with an onClick event handling calling a function called increment count. And whenever we do that, we increment the number on the current count property, which we display in the paragraph above. Pretty straightforward as it stands right now. Nothing too fancy without some crazy interactions. So let's say we want to render that component in one of our existing templates. For example, in this case, our homepage, which is quite a simple example of a HTML and head and body markup. What we have to do is within our body tag, we have to render our component using the render component async method. This is an async method in which we are able to specify which component we want to render and the fact that we want to make sure it is rendered server-side. The reason that we want to specify server pre-rendered is that our front end does not contain WebAssembly, so that we cannot render our client-side. Lastly, we also have to make sure, like we mentioned before, that we include the Blazor server.js somewhere on the same page that we want to render our components, so that we can actually deal with all the interactions that our component may or may not require. Another cool example, and another huge benefit of Blazor WebAssembly, would be that we don't solely have to rely on the events and interactions that get triggered from our browser alone. Because the client and the server are connected, we can trigger an update to all connected clients from our server if we wish to do so. In this example snippet that you can see right here, I was curious if I could find a way to hook into the Umbraco 9 unpublish event, or publishing event, or publishing notification, as I should say, as it's called now with Umbraco 9, to see if I can get a list back from the items that we are publishing and update our client's front UIs whenever we do so. So what I did is I created a singleton service that I inject in both our component and into our Umbraco application. And whenever we hook into the publishing event of Umbraco, we add an entry to that list specifying when we published it and what property we actually published. Within that service, whenever I update that service, I also trigger a property has changed on my component, which tells our front-end client to update itself whenever a change happens. So the result of this experiment would be that whenever I publish an item in Umbraco, our front end, and all connected front ends for that matter, would automatically update with the new data that we have specified. In this example, I'm only using a very simple list where I'm outputting the datetime and the property that we have specified. But in practice, if you would like to do so, you can also make sure to re-render your entire page if any properties on the page that you want have updated, for example. So that is pretty cool. Next up, let's take a look at Blazor WebAssembly with Umbraco 9. Blazor WebAssembly follows a different project structure than Blazor server-side does, as we can't integrate Blazor WebAssembly into our existing application as we're used to. That means that if we want to use Blazor WebAssembly with Umbraco, we'll have to take a look at either a separate or headless solution. We are able to add both the Blazor WebAssembly and Umbraco server clients to an Umbraco server project to the same solution if we wish to do so, as long as we don't have a direct reference between the two projects, because they still both rely on different technologies. There's also one major difference between an Umbraco solution running Blazor server-side versus Blazor WebAssembly, and that is with Blazor server-side you have the option to separate your front end with your server, but sadly with WebAssembly you are required to separate those. A quick sketch on how you would, for example, structure a project like that would be as follows, with an example where our client project and back office project are indirectly coupled together using API calls for any and all server interaction. And optionally, we are able to make use of a shared library between the two, in which we can share, for example, models or logic. Again, we have to make sure that whenever we decide to share logic between the two applications or between the two projects, that we don't directly reference any Umbraco content from within our shared logic, because our Blazor WebAssembly application will scream at us for doing so. So make sure not to do that. During the last few months, I've also been experimenting with such a setup using Umbraco 9 and Blazor WebAssembly, which led me to create a sort of example/starter site to find out what's possible with such a structure. A couple of interesting concepts that I've ran into that I would like to experiment with would be, for example, to share custom view models with both our Umbraco server and our Umbraco client, but also the Umbraco models builder models that can be shared and outputted to a separate project like that. The ability to dynamically serialize our models so that we can request them from our Blazor WebAssembly application to our Umbraco back office application. Things like the new dependency injection models within Blazor WebAssembly are also very interesting to take a look at. And so much more that so many more doors that open with a headless setup like this. So the result of that, as it stands right now, would be a fully decoupled client-side application that uses Razor components or Blazor components for each of the different block list editor models. That's why I'm currently using for example, the homepage, so that we can render them in our front end. This can be compared to, for example, a React or an Angular application where the CMS, and which in this case would be Umbraco, is only used for storing data and the page composition, and the client is responsible for all the markup and handling and requesting of said data. This also means that we still have the complete power of Blazor, so .NET and C# available in, for example, in this case, our block list editor models. In this example, basic front-end interactions as shown on this slide. Which would be, in this case, an on-click listener that can show or hide a paragraph on a frequently asked questions component with the data fully maintained in Umbraco. So that is pretty cool, and it's all available open source on GitHub if you're interested in checking out what's possible and trying it out for yourself. With the latest developments over at Microsoft, and especially with the release of .NET 6, we have a large amount of new great features that are out there with Blazor WebAssembly, making it a lot more interesting than the previous versions. Even though .NET 6 is not officially supported yet for Umbraco 9, if I recall correctly, it is still worth checking out, especially in combination with Blazor WebAssembly. So a couple of interesting points I would like to cover that make using a single-page application framework like Blazor a lot more interesting would be the use of either an application state, or more commonly known as a persistent component state, having to do with pre-rendering. Because one of the major downsides of using a fully standalone front-end client, like for example Angular, React, or in this case Blazor, would be search engine optimization. Because the application is still required to actually fetch its data to show on our application, pre-rendering is a must if you want to make your site public. Luckily, with the use of the application state, especially if we have data-driven pages, we're able to pre-render our application with our data coming from our back office, and only refresh and fetch new data when that data is outdated. So no need to trigger an update straight away when loading our application and causing some sort of refresh. Another interesting component would be the use of metadata, where in previous versions of .NET we were only able to specify the page title within a specific component. With .NET 6 we're able to set any and all metadata from within a subcomponent, so no need to trigger or send the data up to a parent that's actually rendering our page if we want to change the data out from a subcomponent. We also have the ability to use scoped files, which means that we can write CSS and JavaScript files for one specific component without the rest of our application depending on it or even breaking on it, if possible. The use of wildcard page components, so that we can handle custom routing within our own components and pages. And another interesting one would be the use or the reuse of our components for WPF or .NET MAUI applications. I know Purnima is giving a talk this afternoon about .NET MAUI, so I'm sure she will go deeper into this. But it's good to know that whenever we write our components, we're able to not just use them in our browser, but also for desktop and even mobile applications if we wish to do so. Another thing for those who aren't convinced with Blazor yet is instead of our front end completely relying on Blazor, we're able to export our specific Blazor component for either use of React or Angular or any JavaScript framework for that matter that gets supported over time, so that we can dynamically add them to our existing single-page applications. And lastly, but not unimportantly, would be the smaller file sizes. Because using Blazor WebAssembly downloads our entire application by ways of the DLLs that are required, it's good to know that the size gets compromised quite a lot with the upgrade from .NET 5 to .NET 6. Now, with everything that we just learned and with all the information available, the question remains, should I be using Blazor in my existing applications? Or even new applications for that matter. And the answer to that would be, it depends. Just like the decisions you would make to choose or go for a single-page application like we mentioned, React or Angular, Blazor also has the same trade-offs. Each version of Blazor has its own pros and cons, which I've quickly summarized. So taking a look at Blazor WebAssembly first, and the first couple of points share the same pros and cons as Blazor server-side, would be that using Blazor WebAssembly for your client would be great if you have a .NET development team, because everything stays within the same code, same libraries, and the same things that all your developers are familiar with. There's no need to learn too much more within the language itself. The con on the other side would be that it is less useful if you already have a JavaScript development team available, because they either have to learn a new language to work with, or you have to find a way to integrate both projects together, which is very much possible, but it is something to keep in mind. Other than that, there's a huge pro with using Blazor WebAssembly, which would be that you have near native performance of running your application as you would as a standalone application on your site or on your server. And with Blazor WebAssembly, we have offline support, which means that as long as we have our application initially loaded, we are no longer dependent on our server. The only other downside would be with Blazor WebAssembly is that there are still the larger file sizes and download times that are related with Blazor WebAssembly, and the lack of legacy support. Because it runs on WebAssembly, and while all major browsers these days support it, if you were to, for example, still need to support Internet Explorer 11 or earlier, sadly that cannot run WebAssembly. Now let's take a look at Blazor server-side. Like we said with the WebAssembly version, it has the same pros and cons having to do with the runtime. But with the added benefit of Blazor server-side having less loading times, because the initial load is a lot smaller and all code stays on the server instead of having to be downloaded by our client. And there is no need for WebAssembly. But of course, this comes with the major downside that our application does not have offline support, and it requires an active server running ASP.NET Core to run our application. So with that, I hope you have learned something interesting today about the world of Blazor and Umbraco 9. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me either today at DF21. We will be doing a little Q&A session after this talk with Leonard. But if not, you can always find me on Twitter at Corné Hoskam, or check out my tech blog over at cornehoskam.com, where you can also find some links to my further socials. So for now, I would like to thank you all very much for your attention, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corné. Well, as you can see, your Dave's name is already up in the next. So we're really a bit short on time, but I'm still have a few questions for you that I would like to ask. I think you already touched on a lot of things during your talk. One things that I was wondering about, what's the performance overhead of using server-side? Because you mentioned you are making a connection to the server. What if you have thousands of users? Do you have thousands of real-time connections to your website? And what's the limit to that?
That's a very good question. And that's something that still has to be tested in practice from what from as far as I know. I haven't had any experience with it yet with, example, as you would say, thousands of users. But that is indeed a good concern to keep in mind, that it is quite heavy on the server because the server is still responsible for rendering all the UIs of all the connected users.
Yeah.
I'm sure with the latest versions of Blazor, the performance has been increased a lot. But it is good to keep in mind that it is probably rather intensive when you scale your user base.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, you already touched on that the WebAssembly loads a very large file initially, and that it's already being optimized for newer versions. So my question initially was, how would this affect SEO, the search engine optimization? But obviously, you will still always have that overhead of having to load that DLL. So is it possible to have like a loading screen to let people know that things are loading up?
Absolutely, absolutely. By default, there is already a very basic loading screen that isn't very user-friendly, which would be the initial index CSHTML that gets shipped with our application. But we are able to completely override that and customize it if we wish to do so, to make it a lot more user-friendly with more specific loaders, or to give some better user interaction when we're loading our application.
Right, right. Okay, so another interesting question was, can you actually mix WebAssembly and server-side? And would you want to do that?
That's another very good question. I think in theory it should be possible, though I don't really think you'll have a huge amount of benefit from that. I mean, in theory you should be able to, I think, if you wish to still rely on some benefits that Blazor server-side has in your Blazor WebAssembly application.
Yeah, so because the WebAssembly is basically a self-contained website running from the client side of the client.
Exactly.
But you can still call APIs and that sort of stuff. So.
Exactly. And if you wish to do so, I don't see any limit why you shouldn't be able to also establish that signal R connection between either your WebAssembly application and your server, or if you want to just straight up use APIs on a pre-existing server-side application, so that your front end isn't tightly coupled to your WebAssembly or to your server. So yes, absolutely.
All right. Last question for me. Do you have any tips on how to mix normal Razor with Blazor components? Because I can imagine that people already have large web application, but they might be thinking, hey, Blazor looks cool, I want to start using that. But do they really have to convert the whole application to Blazor, or can they use little components? And what's the best way to start doing that? Great
question. And my recommendation would be just take one step at a time. Because it's not completely required to rebuild our entire application if we wish to do so, and we are able to only use specific pages of Blazor WebAssembly or even specific components into our application if we wish to do so. My recommendation would be to just start one step at a time, see what's needed to integrate them into your application without having to completely throw your entire application overboard. And then realize it's maybe is perfect for you or maybe not, but that's something you will have to learn in practice.
All right. Well, these were my questions. Thank you very much